The text we're going to be considering this morning is kind of a special one to me. It's a text I have preached many times in my ministry. In fact, the very first sermon that my wife ever heard me preach was from the text we're going to be considering this morning. I'll never forget her response. Right after the service, she came to me and she goes, "You can do it." I think she thought that anybody who could get up and speak in front of a group of people must be crazy, and she found out that day that I'm crazy because she seemed relieved that I could actually preach since I said I was going to be a pastor. So that's been special to me. I'll never forget. We were in Asia, and we had a young lady from one of our supporting churches there with us, and she was helping Kelly with a week at an English kindergarten or English camp that week. And a house church pastor asked if we would come over and visit their house church. It was a Saturday evening, so I didn't think it was like a worship service. I thought it was more of a just kind of a get-together. They'd invited us over for dumplings and to have dinner with them. And so I thought, well, that'd be a neat experience for this young lady that was visiting with us. So we went over there, and we had dinner, delicious dumplings. That was great. And then they started setting up the chairs in rows, and I thought, okay, well, we're going to maybe have some worship together. And so we all sat down, and we sang some songs, and that was really cool. And then the pastor gets up, and he says, okay, well, we're pleased to have our guest come and preach. And he's looking at me, and I'm like, huh? You didn't tell me I had to preach. Turns out this particular house church, they met on Saturday nights, and this was their regular worship time, and I was apparently with the dinner came the expectation that I was going to preach. And so I reached into my backpack, and I pulled out my Bible, and as I'm walking to the front, I have no idea what I'm about to say. And I'm like, Lord, what do I do? What do I do? Where do I preach? And I just thought, well, open up to Matthew 14 and just preach that message you've preached over and over again. So this message this morning is kind of special. But as I mentioned last week, I don't like to just pull out an old sermon and preach it again. So I spent some time this week studying and preparing this message anew once again. And so as we think this morning about storm winds, I want you to think about storm winds in your life. Could be a meeting with the doctor where you find out that it's cancer. Could be a note from the boss informing you that your position is being eliminated. Maybe it's a call from a bill collector warning you of impending foreclosure on your house. Could be a police officer at your door in the middle of the night informing you of tragedy. Maybe it's a friendship that is lost, a marriage that's on the rocks, or a child that's in rebellion. Storm winds is a metaphor that kind of describes these events that sort of blow into our lives, and often unexpectedly. We don't see them coming. A few weeks ago, about 6:30 in the morning, storm winds blew into our neighborhood. I thought the windows were going to come crashing in. As it turns out, there was a tornado right over our house. And had touched down for about a mile and lifted just short of our house, but did a little damage to our roof. And it came very unexpectedly, and sometimes these storm winds kind of blow into our lives unexpectedly. Maybe you're in the midst of some kind of storm in your life right now. Maybe one will blow into your life at some point during 2022. When the storm winds blow, and you can be sure of this, they will blow. But when they do, I urge you to keep your eyes on Jesus and don't get distracted. Don't get distracted by those storm winds. Turn to Matthew 14 if you haven't done so yet. Matthew chapter 14. We're going to be considering verses 22 through 31 this morning as we continue our present series, Simon Peter, the Witness. And this morning, we're going to see in our text that Peter was a distracted witness. So let's start with verses 22 through 24. There we read this. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way off from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. Point number one this morning is the waves. The waves. We see that in verses 22 through 24. In verse 22, it tells us that immediately, that's a key word there, we'll come back to that word, but immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side of the sea. And the big question we have to ask is, immediately after what? Okay, that's that when you read that word immediately, it tells us, there's something's previously happened. We got to know immediately after what. So if you look back at verses 13 through 21, you'll find the narrative wherein Jesus feeds the multitude of 5,000 men plus women and children, so well over 5,000, with 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he multiplied those 5 loaves and those 2 fish so that it fed this multitude of people. And so it was immediately following that miracle, immediately after that meal of bread and fish that he fed to the multitude, that Jesus is now, he's sending them away in verse 22. It's a bit surprising, actually. We're studying Mark on Wednesday nights. Little commercial, come join us on Wednesday nights for our study of the Gospel of Mark. But when we came to this text in Mark, we found out that the reason Jesus and his disciples went to that particular location was because his disciples needed some rest. And he told his disciples, let's go away, let's find a quiet place where we can go and we can rest and we can have a chance to refresh ourselves a little bit. And so that's why they were there. And of course, then they met this multitude of people, 5,000 men plus women and children. And so Jesus began to teach them. And then they got hungry, and it was dinner time, and so Jesus multiplies the bread and the fish to feed them. And then immediately, it says in verse 22, Jesus is sending them away. They never got a chance to eat. They never got a chance to rest. They never got a chance to refresh themselves. And that's what they came there to do. So we kind of have to ask the question. We read that word immediately. We sense that this is all happening pretty quickly. We have to ask, what's the hurry? Why is Jesus immediately putting his disciples in the boat? They never got the refreshment. They never got the rest that they came there for. Why is he immediately sending them away? Well, if we go to John's Gospel, John chapter 6, verses 14 and 15 informs us of why. And John tells us that something began to happen with that crowd of 5,000 men plus women and children. That they saw the miracle. They saw Jesus multiplying the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. They saw that miracle happening, and they began to get this idea. They looked at Jesus and said, he's the Messiah. By the way, were they right? Yeah, they were right. But they didn't understand what Messiah was. They didn't have a clear understanding of what Jesus was really there to do. See, their perception of the Messiah was a king kind of like David. And they expected this Messiah king to lead them militarily and politically and make their nation a great nation, a powerful nation, a world-leading kind of nation. That's what they expected. That's what they wanted. But that's not what Jesus had come to do. That wasn't what the Messiah was coming to do. They didn't understand what Isaiah had promised about the Messiah, the suffering servant that Isaiah had talked about and what he had promised. They didn't understand that the Messiah had come to suffer and to die for the sins of the people. And so they believe he's the Messiah, and they're correct in that assumption. They just don't understand what the Messiah is. And so they're kind of whipping themselves up into this frenzy at this point. That's what John tells us. They're like ready to make Jesus their king, and even by force if necessary. Did you know someone could be made king by force? If he's made king by force, isn't he more like a slave? And that's kind of but they're ready. They're like, this is it. He's the guy. He's going to be our king. We're going to make him king. Where's the crown? We're going to make him king right now. What if he doesn't want to? It doesn't matter. We'll force them into it if we have to. They're getting whipped up into this frenzy. And so Jesus takes his disciples and leads them to the shoreline and makes them get into the boat and tells them, just start rowing. Go to the other side of the sea. Just go. I'll catch up with you, but you guys just go. And what he's trying to do is get his disciples out of there, out of that building frenzy from the people, because he knew that his disciples would be very much subject to getting caught up into the exact same frenzy. Because his disciples were looking for Messiah. His disciples believed that he was the Messiah. And his disciples, they didn't quite understand what Messiah had come to do either. And so rather than get them caught up into this frenzy, he just sends them out. To protect them from that, he sends them away in the boat. That's why there's a big hurry. That's why it says immediately he put his disciples in the boat. They didn't get the chance to rest that they needed. They didn't get that refreshment, that little vacation that they needed. But it was more important for them to get out of that area, out of that frenzy situation, get them rowing across the sea. And in verse 23, we find that the crowd is sent off. The crowd is sent off. We're not really told how Jesus convinced the crowd to give up their plans, to forcibly make him their king. We don't know what exactly happened. We do know, John tells us that Jesus withdrew to the mountain, so it may just be a matter of, the people, as they're worked up in this frenzy, Jesus just said, okay, the disciples are safe, they're out to sea, and he just walked away and left them. Whatever it was, they finally dispersed and they were sent off. We don't know exactly how he did that, but they get sent off. And then still in verse 23, we see that Jesus prays in solitude. Jesus prays in solitude. John the Baptist, I want you to think about everything that's happened in recent days and everything that's about to happen in Jesus' ministry. So think about just recent events. John the Baptist had recently been beheaded by Herod. And I want you to think, we read that now and it kind of sails over our head. We don't really give it much thought. But I want you to think about how significant that must have been. John the Baptist had gained a following. He had gotten the attention of a nation of people that were coming out to hearing what he had to say, as he was calling them to repentance, to turn away from their sin. And people were so convicted by that. They were cut to the quick, and they actually went into the water and said, I am making a full-fledged commitment to repentance, so much so that it's like they were saying, I'm all in. And so John said, okay, let's get you all into the water. And he baptized them. And they're making this commitment. And this was a big, big deal. And John was preparing the way for Jesus. And now John is dead, having been beheaded by Herod. And I want you to understand that marked a turning point in Jesus' ministry. The heat got turned up quite a bit when John the Baptist was beheaded. Things began to change, and the whole outlook of Jesus' ministry began to change. Also look back to what I was just talking about when he fed the multitude of people. And he'd done a lot of miracles, but this was one of those miracles where we know 5,000 men. How many women and children were there? This is a miracle that was possibly seen by well over 10,000 people. And now you've got a group of well over 10,000 people that are worked up into a frenzy. They're saying, he's the Messiah, he's the one, we're going to go after him, we're going to make him our Messiah. And guess what? The heat gets turned up a little bit more. And then, if you look ahead, you're going to find out that it's not very long, and Jesus is going to start preparing his disciples for the fact that he is going to go to Jerusalem and be crucified and suffer and die. And we're going to deal with that. We're going to talk about that next week, Lord willing. We'll talk more about that next week. But Jesus is going to begin preparing his disciples for what ultimately he came to do. and starting to try to change their minds and help them to understand who Messiah was and what he was really there to do. And I want you to understand that what we're seeing here at this point in Jesus' ministry is a seismic shift in his ministry. We're turning to a whole new chapter of his ministry. And so with all of that in mind, Jesus recognized his need to commune with and fellowship with his Father in prayer. And brothers and sisters, what an incredible example for us to follow. Amen? You need prayer? Do you need to be in prayer? Are we at a critical time in church history? I think we are. Are we at a point, Pastor Chris was talking about, praying for at least 3 people? Who are your 3? Do we need to be in prayer? Are things at a point right now where we desperately need prayer, to be in prayer? Yes, right? And we need to follow this example. And so to do that, let's consider Jesus' prayer. And to do that, we're going to need to do a little math today, all right? I know what you're thinking, because I used to think this too, Math, I hate math. How many of you love math? Anybody? I see 1 hand, 2 hands, 3 hands, 4. Okay, put your hands down. You people make me sick. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know if many of you know this, but David Heidischel's father used to be my math teacher. And I can't tell you how many times I was sitting in his class when I was in high school thinking, when am I ever going to need to know this stuff? And for years and years, I was proven right until this last week. Lo and behold, this last week, I actually needed to do a little math. And I went, oh, okay, well, I finally needed it. Let's do a little bit of math, all right? Now, to start our little math project, we need to look back at verse 15. That's before our present text. But if you look back at verse 15, it tells us that it was evening when the disciples came to Jesus and suggested that he send the crowd off to get dinner. Jesus, of course, didn't send them off. He fed them with the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. But verse 15, what I really want you to see there is that it says it was evening. You see that? Now look at verse 23. In verse 23, it says, again, that evening came. Okay. How is that possible? It was evening back in verse 15, and now evening came. What's happening here? All right. Let's just look at one more verse here real quick. If you look ahead at verse 25, you'll see that it was the 4th watch of the night. All right. So let me help you understand something. The Romans, they divided the nighttime, and they considered the nighttime from 6 o'clock p.m. all the way to 6 o'clock a.m. So 12 hours from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. They divided that into the 4 watches of the night. Okay? And each watch was 3 hours long. So the first watch would be 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. The second watch, 9 p.m. to midnight. Third watch, midnight to 3 a.m., and then the 4th watch would be 3 a.m. to 6 a.m., okay? So, verse 15, evening, it was evening. Probably what that means is that it was about 6 o'clock, okay? The first watch of the night had arrived, about 6 o'clock. It was dinner time. That would make sense. The disciples are saying, let's send them off so they can get something to eat, and Jesus says, let's feed them, and you know the story. 5 loaves and 2 fish feeds the multitude. Verse 23 then, after Jesus had sent the disciples across the lake in the boat and he sends the crowd away and he goes to pray, and now it says now evening had come. Probably what that means is now the second watch of the night had arrived. It could mean that darkness had fallen. It could mean that it was typically bedtime, but probably just means that the second watch of the night had arrived. So it's probably about 9 o'clock now when Jesus is there on the mountaintop and begins to pray. Okay, so about 9 o'clock, all right? Verse 25, I know we haven't read that far yet, but if you look ahead at verse 25, and it's the 4th watch of the night, 4th watch of the night is from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m., all right? So 9 to 3, how many hours is that? Here's the math, okay? That'd be, some of you need to take your shoes and socks off to do this math, right? It's 6 hours, okay? Trust me, I did it. I used my calculator and everything. 6 hours, but I want to suggest to you that verse 25 probably is even later than 3 o'clock, and I'll explain why a little bit later. It's probably well after 5 o'clock in the morning, so probably it's more like 8 hours have gone by. So, if Jesus began praying at 9 p.m., and he prayed until the 4th watch of the night, how long did he pray? He prayed for like 6 to 8 hours. He prayed through the night. What if I asked you to pray for 1 hour? What would you think about that? How many of you would be a little bit intimidated by that? Pray for 1 hour. You know, and I know, don't be ashamed of that, because I'm raising my hand. I'm a little bit intimidated by that. 1 hour of prayer. Can you imagine 6 to 8 hours of continual prayer? It's hard for us to imagine praying for 30 minutes or even 10 minutes sometimes. But Jesus prayed through the night. And notice that he was alone. He prayed in solitude. Just he and his Father communing and fellowshipping in prayer. And I don't know about you, but when I contemplate our Lord's prayer life, it makes my prayer life seem rather pathetic. Do you think maybe we need to start taking prayer far more seriously than we do? Do you think we ought to be giving it far more time than we do? We need to get more serious about our prayer lives. We'll come back to that at the end. I'll talk more about that later. Well, Jesus prayed for 6 to 8 hours, but what the disciples, what were the disciples doing that whole time? If you look at verse 24, we see the disciples struggle. Okay, the disciples struggle. John's gospel tells us that by that time they were about 3 to 4 miles away. All right, it's speculated that it was about 5 miles across the Sea of Galilee, and they're about 3 to 4 miles away. So they're roughly 1.5 miles away from the shore, give or take a little bit. And they'd been going all night. Now, typically, for these guys to go all the way across the sea, they should have been able to do it in well under this time. They should have been able to reach shore well within that time frame, but they're struggling to get across. Their progress is slowed as they battle the wind and the waves. That's what verse 24 tells us. And because of that, it made their journey hard and long and exhausting. And I think about this. If it was such a long and hard and exhausting journey, why did they even bother making it? Why did they leave shore to begin with? Wouldn't it have made sense to say, we'll just camp out here tonight, and when the wind dies down tomorrow, then we'll go across, and it'll be easy to do that? Why did they fight through the night to get across the shore? The answer is found in verse 22. Because Jesus made them get into the boat and told them to go. Didn't Jesus know that it was going to be long and hard and exhausting? You bet he did. And yet he sent them anyway. He sent them on their way. You know, last week we talked about how the Lord, directs us to do things that don't always make sense. Well, I want you to understand that sometimes the Lord directs us to do things that are hard and long and exhausting. And that reality can be hard to bear, but I want you to remember this. God always knows what he's doing. That'd be a really good place for an amen. I'll set you up again. God always knows what he's doing. God is never taken off guard by the circumstances in our life. He always has a perfect plan. And even in the hard times, even in the struggles, even when it's hard and long and exhausting, God knows what he's doing. Even when the storm winds that we talked about earlier are blowing into your life and making things really hard, God has a plan. He has a purpose for that struggle that you're going through. And he does not make mistakes. You believe that? I hope you do. God does not make mistakes. Listen, there are never any oversights for God. Sometimes there's things that I just overlook. This morning as I was thinking through the announcements, the announcement for the membership class, got to get signed up for that. Oh, I never made the sign-up list for that. By the way, I was homesick most of the week, so hopefully that's a good excuse. But it's an oversight. God doesn't have oversights. There's never a moment where God says, "Ooh, I forgot about that." There's never a moment where God says, "Ooh, I didn't see that coming." God doesn't make mistakes. He doesn't have oversights. He has a plan and a purpose, even when the storm winds blow into your life, even when things get hard and long and the struggle is real. God has a plan and a purpose for your struggle, and you can trust Him in the midst of the storm. Let's look at verses 25 through 29. It says, "And in the fourth watch of the night he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, 'It's a ghost.' And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, 'Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid.' And Peter answered him, 'Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water.' He said, 'Come.' So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus." Point number 2 this morning is the walking. The walking. Of course, our focus right now is the walk upon the surface of the water, first by Jesus, and then momentarily anyway, by Simon Peter. I want to drive home the point that Jesus and Peter did in divinely miraculous fashion walk upon the surface of the water. Okay, I want to make that very, very clear. I was rather shocked this week in my study to read one commentator argue for an interpretation of this text wherein Jesus didn't walk on the surface of the water, but rather around the sea along the shoreline. Another commentator argued that Peter never actually walked on the water, but began to sink immediately upon exiting the boat. Now, there is some precedent in the Greek grammar to make such an assumption about Jesus walking along the shoreline, but the overwhelming evidence, both contextually and theologically, would never lead us to that conclusion. Let me be very, very clear that Jesus, the same Jesus who had the previous evening taken 5 small loaves of bread and 2 fish and multiplied them to feed a huge multitude of people, the same Jesus who at an earlier point on that same sea, raging in a storm, calmed that sea with the word of command. The same Jesus who is the author of creation, who spoke it all into existence. I want to be very clear on this fact that Jesus walked upon the surface of the water. And He walked like 3 or 4 miles from where He had been praying all night to where His disciples had been able to row at that point. Let me also be very clear that Peter, for a few fleeting moments, walked by faith in the power of his Lord on the surface of the water. And those of you who say, "But that's impossible," you fail to understand this basic truth that with God all things are possible. This wasn't the first time that God had granted miraculous ability to mere people. Look back in the Old Testament. Remember Moses? Think about the things that God allowed him to do and to experience. Remember Elijah, Elisha. Think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Remember they were in the flames, came out unsinged. This isn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last time that Peter would experience this kind of miraculous power. After Jesus ascended into heaven, Peter had the ability to heal a lame beggar. And so it shouldn't come as a surprise to us that Peter would be given this ability, granted this ability to walk upon the surface of the water and do miraculous things. And notice, as we think about this walking, the 2 walks, Jesus walking in the water and then Peter, one walk produced fear, okay? One walk produced fear. In verse 25, we learn that Jesus came walking to the disciples on the sea in the 4th watch of the night. Once again, that would have been, the 4th watch would have been sometime between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. Here's the evidence for why I think is a little bit later in that watch, is they could see him coming. Okay? They couldn't quite identify him. It wasn't broad daylight, but there was enough light that they could see someone coming. All right, and if you've ever been up early in the morning, been outdoors, you know that there comes a point where the eastern sky begins to glow a little bit as the sun is getting ready to break over that horizon. So I'm guessing it was probably sometime after 5 a.m. They could see him coming to them. And they didn't see him swimming toward them, did they? Look at verse 26. They saw him walking on the sea. That would definitely fall under the category of things you don't see every day. Matthew goes on to tell us that they were terrified, and all God's people said, well, duh. All right? I mean, did Matthew really have to tell us that they were terrified? I think I'd probably be a little freaked out by that if I saw that coming. Matthew was actually one of the they, so as he's writing this, he's probably reliving that, remembering that fear, that terror that he felt in his own heart. He actually tells us that they thought they saw a ghost. Doesn't really sound very rational, does it? You know, belief in ghosts. You know, we don't believe in ghosts, right? Actually, the Greek word that Matthew uses here is it's the word phantasma. It's where we get the English word phantom, and it can be used to render that word ghost, but it can also just be rendered as spirit. And so it's possible that maybe what Matthew meant was that they thought they saw some sort of demonic apparition coming toward them rather than a disembodied spirit or ghost. That would make more sense if he had something demonic in mind, because they'd seen a lot of demonic activity. They'd seen Jesus cast a lot of demons out. Either way, they were terrified and they cried out in fear. Look at verse 27. But what? Immediately. There's that word again. Remember we read that in verse 22. Immediately. Here it is again. Immediately, Jesus spoke to them. He said, "Take heart, it is I." Loosely translated, take heart means, man up, fellas. Show some backbone, guys. That's kind of what that means. But then he says to them, do not be afraid. If someone has counted all the times in the Bible that the Bible declares these words, do not be afraid, and it's come up, you know what the number is? 365 times. Isn't that interesting? How many days are there in a year? It's almost like God knew we needed a daily reminder not to fear, right? I'm probably taking that a little bit too far, but we do sort of need that, don't we? How many of you ever worry? Okay. How many of you ever you start to fear the worst? You think things are, the sky is falling, right? We tend to live in fear. And so over and over again, the Bible tells us, do not be afraid, do not be afraid, do not be afraid. In fact, in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7, Paul wrote, God gave us a spirit, not of fear, but of power and love and self-control. Phoebe's on her senior trip right now, so I figured she's not here. I got free rein to use her as a sermon illustration this morning, okay? This is our little secret, though, okay? You don't go blabbing this to her when she comes back, all right? But I'm going to just go ahead and use her. When Phoebe was young, when she was a little girl, she hated the fact that when it came to be bedtime, she had to be all alone. If you think about it, we have two sons, and so her two brothers, they shared a bedroom together. They weren't alone. Of course, mom and dad, we shared a bedroom together. We weren't all alone, but she had to be all alone in her own bedroom. She hated that, and she was scared. She didn't like that. She was afraid to be all alone. And so what she'd do is she'd wait until we all went to bed, and then she'd get out of her bed and she'd sneak into our room and try to crawl into bed with us so that she wouldn't be all alone. Now, being the good father that I am, I laid down the law and said, no, this isn't going to happen. You have to stay in your own room, all right? Being the big softy that my wife is, she taught our daughter, just sneak quietly, come around the bed and lay on my side of the bed on the floor, and we'll just, Mama Bear was protecting, her little cub from the big mean Papa Bear, and Phoebe came in and she slept on our floor. Why? Why was she afraid? Why did she feel like she needed to come into our room? Because it's scary when you're all alone, isn't it? It's scary when you're all alone. In fact, in Hebrews chapter 13, verses 5 and 6, we read these familiar words, this familiar promise where God promises never to leave us nor forsake us. And then he goes on to say with confidence, "The Lord is my helper. I will not fear." Why don't we need to fear? Because he will never leave us. He will never forsake us. He is with us, and therefore we are not alone. All right, so let's go back to our text. When the disciples are terrified, Jesus says, "Take heart. It is I." Why didn't he say, "It is me," by the way? Any English teachers here, can you explain that to me after the service? I've been wrestling with that all week, why he didn't say, "It is me." But he said, "Take heart, it is I." In other words, Jesus is saying, you're not alone. So you don't need to be afraid. I'm here with you. Isn't that great? Because brothers and sisters, I got news for you. If you are in Christ, if you've put your faith and trust in Christ, then guess what? You are not alone. Not ever. Because he's promised to never leave you, to never forsake you, and therefore you do not need to fear. I hope that's an encouragement to you this morning. So one walk, Jesus' walk on the water produced fear, but one walk proceeded from faith. One walk proceeded from faith. It is my humble opinion that Peter gets a bad rap in the church today. Was he impulsive? Sure he was. But you know what? God uses impulsive people, and he surely used Peter. But I do not believe that the account we read in verses 28 and 29 represent the impulsive side of Peter. I believe they reveal the faith and the passion of Peter. Hearing Jesus identify himself, Peter wants to go and be with Jesus. And you say, well, that doesn't make sense because Jesus was coming to them, wasn't he? It's kind of always my assumption growing up. Jesus was coming to them. He was always going to get into the boat, right? Not if we look at Mark's gospel. In Mark chapter 6, verse 48, we find out differently. We learn that Jesus wasn't intending to join the disciples in the boat. He was just walking past them. Remember, he sent them on ahead. He said, I'll catch up with you. And this is what Jesus was doing. He was probably going to the other side, and he would have met them when they finally made it to shore. So Peter's like, I don't want to wait. It's taken us all night just to get this far. How long is it going to take us to finish that last mile and a half to the shore? I want to be with Jesus right now. And what we see here is Peter's passion to get to the Lord, to be with the Lord. So Peter says in verse 28, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. You see that word if? Lord, if it is you. How many of you read that and think, well, there's doubt there? If Peter's saying, if it is you, that must mean there's doubt, right? How many of you think that Peter's doubting? Anyone? Okay, a few honest people. I appreciate that. All right. It's very easy to come to that conclusion, that Peter is doubting here. But the fact of the matter is, Peter puts forth an if-then proposition that would make absolutely no sense if he had doubted. Wouldn't it have made more sense, if he was really doubtful about whether or not that was Jesus, wouldn't it have made more sense for him to say, Lord, if it is you, tell me, what did we have for dinner last night? That doesn't put Peter at any risk, right? If it was you, tell me what we had for dinner last night. Well, we had bread and fish. Remember I multiplied the, oh, okay, yeah. Lord, if it was you, who was it that you healed when you came to my house that one Sabbath? Peter, it was your mother-in-law, don't you remember? Yeah, okay, that's it. Doesn't put Peter at any risk. If Peter had doubt, it makes absolutely no sense for him to say, Lord, if it is you, tell me to come to you on the water. Now you're putting yourself at risk. So I don't see where Peter is doubting at all. What I see is Peter's faith. That if the Lord commands him, he can walk on the water. That's what I see in Peter. And so he's not doubting here in this verse. And also, by the way, if you look at verse 29, not only does the if-then proposition of verse 28 tell us that Peter has faith, but so do his actions in verse 29. Because Jesus, with that if-then proposition, if it is you, then tell me to come to you on the water, then Jesus says, come. And what's Peter's action? Think about that. I mean, I can kind of see myself, when Jesus says come, maybe saying, are you sure? Let me just double clarify, let me be like Gideon, let me put out the fleece one more time and make sure. I could totally see myself doing something like this. Here's the side of the boat, I could see myself like keeping my weight in the boat, maybe having my brother Andrew hold onto my hand, don't let go, and kind of step over onto the side of the boat and just kind of put my foot down on the water a little bit, make sure the surface of the water is going to hold me. That wouldn't be faith, would it? That's not what Peter did. If Peter had doubts, his actions would have revealed those doubts. But his actions reveal anything but doubt. His actions reveal faith. And so the Lord says, come, and what does Peter do? He got out of the boat. Can you believe that? He got out of the boat. Everyone look at your neighbor and say, Peter got out of the boat. He walked on the water. He came to Jesus. And friends, I'm here to tell you that every step he took on the surface of that water was a step of faith. Peter walked by faith until he didn't. Look at verses 30 and 31. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Point number 3, the waver. The waver. Peter was walking by faith until that faith wavered. Why did his faith waver? Well, his faith wavered because of the distraction and doubt. Because of the distraction and doubt. Verse 30, it says, but when Peter saw the wind, there is the distraction. It's an interesting phrase, isn't it? Can you see wind? Anyone ever seen wind? You really can't see wind, can you? You can see the effect of wind. You could see, trees swaying in the wind or a flag, flying in the wind, but you can't actually see wind. Maybe what Peter saw was, maybe he saw Jesus' hair or his cloak blowing wildly in the wind. Maybe he saw spray from the sea rising up because of the wind. But the important thing here isn't what he saw. The important thing, the important takeaway in all of this is that Peter took his eyes off of Jesus. He got distracted, and so his faith wavered. He'd been walking by faith with his eyes fixed on Jesus, but then he got distracted by the storm winds that blew. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, the author of Hebrews writes this, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so easily, so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and seated at the right hand of the throne of God." I love how the New International Version, the NIV, renders the beginning phrase, the opening phrase of verse 2 there. In the NIV it says, "Let us fix our eyes on Jesus." Let us fix our eyes on Jesus. Peter had his eyes fixed on Jesus, and he was walking by faith. And then the storm winds blew, and he stopped looking to Jesus. He stopped fixing his eyes on Jesus. Instead, he saw the storm winds. He got distracted. Has that ever happened to you? You're walking by faith, your eyes are fixed on Jesus, your trust is in him, and then the storm winds begin to blow into your life. That unexpected word from the doctor, that unexpected word from the company that your position is no longer in place, that call from the bill collector, that broken relationship. You ever had that time in your life where you're walking by faith and then the storm winds begin to blow into your life, and what happens? We get distracted by the things of this world. And now we're sinking in doubt and in despair. That's what happened to Peter when he saw the wind. His faith wavered, and it was replaced by doubt. And when faith gives way to doubt, listen, friends, when faith gives way to doubt, then there's always something that will take the place of faith. You know that? And you know what it is? It's fear. When faith gives way to doubt, there's always something that's ready to take the place of faith in your life, and it's fear. That's what happened to Peter. You see it there in verse 30? Look again at verse 30. It says, but when he saw the wind, okay, now the doubt comes in and faith is wavering. What takes the place of faith? It's fear. He was afraid. And so Peter cried out, Lord, save me. That brings us to the deliverance from devastation. The deliverance from devastation. Peter cries out, Lord, save me. And what does Jesus do in verse 31? Does he say to Peter, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? Yes, he did. But is that the first thing he did? What did he do immediately? There's that word again. We saw it in verse 22. Immediately, Jesus protected his disciples from the frenzy that was building in the crowd, and he sent them away. We saw it again in verse 27 when the disciples are terrified. And he immediately reassures them of his presence with them and says, you don't have to be afraid. And now in verse 31, as Peter is crying out, Lord, save me, when Peter needs rescue from the devastation of the raging surf, Jesus immediately reaches out and takes hold of Peter. Perhaps you've seen the painting by the Korean artist Young-Sung Kim, where we see Jesus from Peter's perspective, beneath the surface of the water, reaching down to take hold of him. What a moment that must have been for Peter. He cried out to Jesus, and immediately Jesus reached out to him. Friend, please know that if you call out to Jesus, he will always hear you, and he will never forsake you. But let's not miss one last thing, because we haven't gotten to the end of verse 31. Yes, Jesus immediately delivered Peter from devastation, but he did also have those hard words of rebuke and instruction. And he says to Peter, "O you of little faith." Folks, in my study this week, as I was preparing for this message, I had to sit back in my chair and exhale and say, whoa. What had Peter just been doing? Walking on the surface of the water. He was walking by faith, literally walking by faith in a way like I've never walked in my life. Yeah, he got distracted. Yes, he doubted and fear took over and he began to sink. But he was just walking on the water. And he hears the words, "Oh, you of little faith." Friends, if Peter's faith is little, what does that say about my faith? What does it say about your faith? I was like, Lord, why are you showing me this? What am I supposed to learn from this? And my takeaway in my study was this: Mike, you have a long, long, long way to go in learning what it means to trust me with all your heart and leaning not on your own understanding. Are you there with me? Anyone here, have you arrived at perfect faith? Anyone? We all have a long ways to go, don't we? We all have a long ways to go. Oh, you of little faith. Why did you doubt? Peter had some lessons to learn. He needed to learn that when the storm winds began to blow into his life, and they would continue to blow into his life, but he had to learn when those storm winds begin to blow, fix your eyes on Jesus. Trust him with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. Keep trusting him. Keep walking by faith. All right, so what? What do we do with this? What do we do with this amazing story? I've got 4 points of application as I close. First, we need to get serious about our prayer lives. We need to get serious about our prayer lives. Jesus found a place of solitude and prayed for hours on end. And listen, folks, I fear that if we're honest, some of us struggle to give the Lord more than just a few minutes of hurried prayer each day. Not many of us can pray for hours on end like Jesus did, but let me ask you a few questions. Do you have a time and a place where, like Jesus, you can be alone to pray, free from distractions, so that you focus on intentional communion and fellowship with God in prayer? Do you have that? Do you have that time every day? Do you have that place every day where you focus on prayer? Do you worship God in your prayer? Sometimes our prayer lives just become, Lord, help so-and-so and be with so-and-so, and so-and-so's in the hospital. And do you worship God when you pray? That's important. Do you give thanks to God in prayer? Do you count your blessings and give thanks to God? Do you confess your sin to God and pray and commit to repentance? We need to get serious about our prayer lives. Second, if you struggle with fear, then recognize your own doubt and understand your need for fellowship with the Lord, who promised to never leave you and never forsake you. Okay? If you struggle with fear, I want you to understand that fear has taken the place of faith in your heart. So you need to identify the doubt, and you need to get back in fellowship with the Lord, and remember that He is with you. He will never forsake you. And you need to trust in Him and not fear, but have faith in Him. Someone might be here this morning, they're like, I don't have this fellowship with God, but I sure wish that I did. If that describes you, friend, then know that you can have that fellowship or that relationship with God, but it has to come through faith in Jesus. It has to come through faith in Jesus. Jesus is God's Son who became a man in order to die in our place and to pay for our sin. It was a payment that only He could make because He's God, so He's completely holy, but He's also human, so He could die. In other words, the life that He could offer was perfection, and that's the only payment that was suitable for our sin. And that's who Jesus is. That's why He came into this world, to die and to pay for your sin. He rose again, which testifies to the fact that He is God in human flesh, that His life was perfection and death had no claim on Him. And so He lives today to bring you into a right relationship with God. But that can only happen when you put your faith and trust in Him. It doesn't happen by your works. It doesn't happen by your religion. It can only come through faith. If you are ready to place your faith in Jesus, then simply tell Him that right now. And then I would just ask, following the service this morning, if you would just come and tell me that as well. If you're watching the live stream, would you please leave a comment right now? If you have questions about these things, you want to talk further about these things, let us know that, and we would love to be able to talk with you further. Third point of application: don't doubt when the Lord directs you to obey. He said to Peter, "Come," and Peter got out of the boat. What's the Lord directing you to do today? Will you take those first steps of faith and obey Him? And then finally, last one, if you get distracted by the storm winds that blow into your life and lose your Christ-centered focus, if you do begin to sink into the mire of despair, call out to Him. Call out to Him. He will deliver you from the despair that you're in. But I would urge you to be careful to learn the lessons that He's teaching you, because He will teach you those lessons. And it may be this: "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" You've got to learn to keep trusting the Lord with all your heart.